Ugh, you know that feeling when you eat too much pasta? Ugh. Happy August. CNFers, the frontrunner, strides into the dog days of summer. Been getting some nice texts and emails about reader feedback. Turn those texts and emails into online reviews. We could use all we can get. I'm not going to read them. I haven't read anything on Amazon, nor will I. But if you would like to turn some of those that feedback into a review, I would greatly appreciate it. Not much by way of events going on in August. Do have this thing called a Night of Nonfiction with Hippocampus Magazine. It's Hippocamp Online on Saturday, August 16th from 6 to 8 p.m. There is a debut CNF author reading and discussion featuring, if I butcher some of these names, apologies, Tia Levings, Teresa Okukan, Hyasung Song, Casey Mulligan Walsh, special guest opener Anna Maria Formicella, and your featured author is your boy, Brendan O'Mara. Hey. Free to attend for this one. There's a weekend pass, I guess, for like $75. And individual sessions or whatever for like $25. But go to hippocampusmagazine.com/events and you can enroll in this one for free. Free. Also, I had a flash essay run over at shortreads.org titled Racing Rachel Ray. It's about a lot of things crammed into 1,000 words. You got some nice feedback on that too on the Instagrams. It's number 124, I believe, over on Shortreads. Anyway, go check that out. Short-reads.org. Racing Rachel Ray.
The journalism, there's always a little bit of with your nose up against the window looking in.
Okay, it's that Atavistian time of the month, so we're here to talk about Matthew Wolfe's The Talented Mr. Bruseaux. He made his name in Chicago investigating racial violence, solving crimes, and exposing corruption. But America's first black private detective was hiding secrets of his own. Go to magazine.atavist.com to read that story, or maybe consider subscribing. I don't get any kickbacks. Should I? So we'll be hearing from Matt in due time. It's not Matt's first story with the Atavist, and we talk a little bit about that first story as well. Matt is a journalist, and I believe he wrapped up a PhD in sociology. He's got a book coming out next year, and we'll be sure to tout that when the time comes. Show notes of this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there. You can peruse hot blogs and sign up for my two very important newsletters, the flagship Rage Against the Algorithm and Pitch Club. Issue 3 of Pitch Club just dropped with Kim H. Cross. We got a flood of new subscribers. Let's keep doing it. Let's just keep building this thing. Neither newsletter will cost you a dime. All I ask is for your permission, because platform is currency. Your permission is currency, and I will never violate that. Both are first of the month, no spam. So far as I can tell, you can't beat them. And you might also elect to join the Patreon crew, patreon.com/CNFpod, to throw some dollar bills into the CNF Pod coffers. You can earn some nice face-to-face time with me if you dare. Check it out, friend. Helps keep the lights on here. Which brings me to thanking Peter Bryant for becoming a patron. Thank you so much for coming on board. Thanks for the support. Hope to make it worth it. So batting leadoff here is none other than lead editor Jonah Ogles. And for those of you who may have missed Sayward Darby the last several months, she'll be back soon. She came back from maternity leave, and I believe she's working on a narrative podcast. Some of you might be worried. Well, one of you might be worried. None of you might be worried. So Jonah and I talk about the ideal writer to work with and get into how he edited Matt's piece. And we got a parting shot about aging dogs, specifically Sister Kevin here. So let's cue up the montage.
You fucking idiot, give me that! Which is like how I feel about myself.
Okay, whatever, like, you do you.
If Mars had an area code.
Before I know it, I'm shot with an arrow and this thing has grabbed me.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
When you find yourself in conversation with, say, other editors, what do you find yourself talking about the most?
I mean, I suspect it's kind of similar. Editors may talk a little bit more. Well, I don't know. We talk about magazine money too. There's a lot of state of the industry talk, which I'll skip in this conversation, but just because it's so depressing, not because it's like state secrets or anything. But we talk about stories usually. Like I want to know what editors are working on. I want to know like what story they're excited about, what writers. I'm always trying to find out if somebody's working with somebody good or is reading somebody good. But we talk about stories, basically like the nuts and bolts of putting a story together, and what, how a story is going. What are they working on now? What has the editing process been like? Is the writer collaborative, or are they pushing back on edits, and how do you deal with a structural problem, or anything I think that writers are probably talking about with their own drafts. I think editors are having pretty similar conversations about how to get this done. It's not like we have the manual. We just have maybe a little more consistent experience doing it every month.
Yeah, and you talk about the depressing nature of the industry at large, and which is easily writers experience it, editors experience it. Knowing that's the table stakes of it all, like just how do you, as best you can, block that out and proceed in the face of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it helps to be at the Atavist, where we're doing all right, and I don't feel any like extinction event on the horizon for us. But we talk about it. I think I try to like acknowledge it, and I need to spend a little time worrying about it before I can not worry about it, and conversations with friends, editor friends, writer friends. It helps to have those and just kind of get it out of your system. But once you're sitting there, certainly when you're in a story, it's pretty easy to sort of set it aside and just get into the words. I think where I think about it more often is pitches, honestly, and part of it is I just feel bad rejecting stories that are close, maybe, that are like, it's a good idea, it's not quite right for us, or it's a story that won't work for us, but I want to read it. And writers may ask, where might I send this? Do you know where a good home might be? And it's harder and harder to answer that question. We used to recommend California Sunday a fair bit when that was still in operation, because they had great editors and we're doing just some really phenomenal work with amazing writers. And we can't do that. We can't do that anymore. Hakai was one that I used to send people to if it was kind of more nature based. And the number of publications out there doing good work where I feel like comfortable sending writers, because I know they'll be treated somewhat well. It's just a dwindling list at this point, and that's where it can wear you down when you're spending a lot of time trying to come up with an answer and there's not a good one.
For sure. And we've probably talked about this any number of times, maybe over the years, but I feel like it's been a while. So it's kind of maybe good to refresh this. And if you had to, sketch out the perfect writer, reporter to work with, what does that person look like?
Somebody who is willing to like talk through problems that they're having, being upfront, I think, about the issues they maybe had in the reporting or the writing of the draft is really helpful for me to hear. If they're struggling with something, be it structure or drawing out like a particular plot line or a character, it helps me to know that, not only to help brainstorm, but it helps to read the piece knowing that that's something that maybe they've hit a wall with, or they don't think they can get much more material, just so that I'm not saying, hey, here's this big edit memo, I want to flesh out this character and make her the star of everything. And they're like, I actually don't have anything else. So yeah, somebody who's collaborative and really wants to like work with an editor, I think is really helpful. Somebody who just has their sources locked down, like when I get a draft and it's annotated, that's always a really good sign. Because it says to me the writer has been thinking about the reporting at every step and is laying everything out so that I know the draft is going to be pretty clean from a fact check standpoint. And it also helps me, there are times, Sayward is actually amazing at this. She does it way more than I do, but like we'll dive into some of those sources in the footnotes and read that story or read the news article or whatever it is, and find something that we're like, oh, this is interesting, this should go into the piece. Yeah, so what really like has their reporting on lockdown, collaborative, is communicative about missing deadlines. At least I'm lucky that we don't I don't have to be too harsh on deadlines, but I like to know what's going on with the story. And even if it's just an update, like, hey, finished my reporting trip, and I'm going to need extra time, that's fine. I just like to know that type of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know if that gives you like a picture of a whole person or not, but I like all of those things.
Oh, that's really insightful. Just for people who, you want to have a good back and forth with your editor because it's in service of the story. And more and more, freelancers or people wanting to do this kind of work might not have a good editor-writer relationship where they're learning the best skills to be the best collaborator, to be someone who's fun to work with, but someone who knows how to tactfully push back and have a dialogue about something that's going in or taken out of a story. You never want to be a difficult person to work with, but without having the experience working with someone, you might not have the opportunities to really hone that skill. So if people can kind of work on it in private and kind of visualize what it means to be a pleasure to work with, because if you can dispel of all that drama, then the story is just going to be so much better. And so yeah, just having your sketch of what that person looks like, be like someone listening could be like, oh, okay, maybe. Oh, that's good. I got to have my sources a bit more buttoned up, because now that that's buttoned up, we can start working on some higher level things.
Yeah, exactly. And it's nice to work with writers who, when they do need to push back, sort of zero in on the stuff that's most impactful to a story. Because a lot of times, like if I cut something, I try to say this to writers when I'd send them edits, but like if I cut something that was important, it probably wasn't clear to me that it was important, or I wouldn't have cut it, because I'm not necessarily cutting for space. I mean, I want pace to be right, but I'm not worried about like 8,500 words versus 8,000.
Yeah.
So, being able to sort of like know which changes are important and sort of like treating it more as like, hey, here is why this mattered to me as a writer and what I think it was doing for the story. That's super helpful information, and that feels more like a conversation to an editor than just that graph was important, so I've put it back in, like that, which is fine. Like I can then say, well, why is it important? Help me understand. But it's a lot more fun for me when they're coming back and saying, clearly something wasn't working, or but this is what I want it to do, or what I think it should do in the story.
Nice. Yeah. And with Matt's story here, when speaking about annotation, I always, this is what writers and journals nerd out about too, is just like the degree of sourcing and how intensive it was. In the draft that I had, I could see, I'm like, oh my God, like sometimes half the page are footnotes. It's like, whoa, this is some heavy duty research he's doing, and he's citing it as he's going along. So you as the editor be like, oh, okay, this guy he's done some legwork. There's hundreds of sources on an 8,000 word story. It's like, holy shit, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So well, talk about Matt and and his approach to this story on Sheridan. Bruseaux, is that his name? Fuck.
Yeah, Bruseaux. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Matt is actually a return writer. He co-wrote an early Atavist piece well before my time. So it was, but he wrote it. That was the era where like the Atavist was new, and I was like a young editor and was just like obsessed with these Atavist stories. You know, they're so log and they're kind of quirky and different than what you might read in other magazines. So it was cool. It was cool to get to work with somebody who'd written one of those like original classics that the Atavist had published. And, you know, we love like unknown history stories, you know, like that's a great one. And this one, you know, had like there's a crime at the heart of it, a political assassination in Chicago, and kind of the height of the Capone era, you know, so that, you know, there's like some grabby stuff in the pitch, but really it's a story about this guy who has just kind of been forgotten by history, despite having launched this sort of incredible career in an era when you would not necessarily expect a black man to be able to run such a huge private detective agency or private investigation agency. You know, it was one of those pitches that just kind of kept hitting me with stuff that was interesting, like, oh, that aspect is interesting. You're like, oh, that's crazy. And it made it a pretty easy one for us to want to publish.
You know, throughout the story too, as it comes to light towards the end, there's a Gatsby element to this story, and without giving away too much, but it's what is the appeal, and why does the Gatsby narrative really endure, and certainly in the 20th century, but even giving way to the 21st century? There's something about the Gatsby archetype that resonates and feels timeless in this country.
Yeah, it seems kind of like woven into the fabric of like our national character. You know, we've got, there's a long history of it. You know, it's not like F. Scott Fitzgerald like created it out of whole cloth and then it came into being. You know, he was in tune. He saw what was going on, and you know, I'd put it, obviously just a wonderful book. I mean, everybody like might be one of the few books that like everybody in America has to read if they finish high school. But yeah, I mean, they're great. It also makes for great reading, you know, because there are myths and fabrications and close calls and being discovered and there's just, you know, having someone trying to create their own myth allows for a lot of dramatic moments that makes for good reading, good writing.
And as you know, when we have these conversations, I love getting the unique challenges that were presented to you on your side of the table. You know, when you got, be it the pitch or the draft or anything. So, you know, just with this one, what was unique to this story that that you were working with, and the code you were trying to crack with it?
Yeah, I mean, it came in pretty great shape, honestly. You mentioned the footnotes that were in the draft. I mean, those were in there like the moment he sent it to me. So I knew we were on really, really solid ground on the reporting front. You know, I think the bulk of my work on this was about pace, which is kind of always the case, you know, just trying to cut stuff that didn't feel essential, or felt like it kind of gummed up the narrative at moments when I didn't really want to be pulled away from the story, you know, because in this case, like I mentioned, it kicks off with this political assassination, which Bruseaux is hired to investigate. And it's sort of this huge watershed moment in Chicago political history. but that goes away. Like, we're basically done with that in the first half of the story, you know, and you would think like, oh, you stretch that case out and you kind of tell everything, you know, that would make it, I think, a lot easier for the narrative to feel like, to just keep readers' interest all the way to the end. But because we were doing away with that and sort of spinning into the falsehoods that Bruseaux had sort of baked into his resume, you know, you don't have something quite as like tactile to latch on to, and he's sort of jumping from investigation to investigation. So I suspect this is the case, but I think I did most of my trimming probably in the latter half of the piece, where, you know, we might have strayed into, well, he was doing, you know, he investigated a race riot in Detroit and started to shift into, you know, Detroit history or background or things like that. But you need to stay tethered to Bruceau's personal life at that point in order to keep readers feeling like they're, you know, being pulled along by the narrative rather than like, you know, just sort of reading it out of duty or anything.
And this happens a lot in Atavist stories too, where you'll open with something that is very evocative and dramatic, but it also runs the risk of creating a different expectation for the rest of the story that cascades from it. Like you don't want, like you said, like this particular case, you know, you maybe could have been the entire backbone of the thing, but you say, like, you know, halfway through, you're kind of resolve that issue. So when you're structuring a story, you know, how are you doing the math in your head that, okay, you know, this thing is so powerful, but it might set up a reader expectation that's not going to pay off because we're going a different direction. Like, I imagine that's a math you're working with sometimes.
Yeah, it is. And you're trying to decide whether or not they'll feel duped or whether it'll be a nice surprise.
Yeah.
You know, like that's always, because I'm a sucker for a story that, like, the first section or two are about something that maybe the rest of the story isn't really about. I like that as a reader. But when you're trying it, you want to, or at least like the tricks I try to use, I try to seed the idea that something else is coming early in the piece. And I think in this case, we did it just with like the opening section, the last line in that, you know, like Sheridan Bruseaux spent a career like trying to unearth secrets, but turns out he was keeping a few of his own. And you hope that lets readers know there's some other stuff that's gonna happen in this story. And then you've got to really make it pay off at the end, you know, because if the lie was, you know, he claimed to be a vegetarian, but he wasn't, like, you know, you're going through way too many words to get to that. Like, the readers are just going to close the window and stop caring. So you've got to make sure that, like, you get to it soon enough, I think, that readers don't feel duped, and then you've got to make sure that the dramatic stakes kind of pay off too.
Oh, amazing. Well, Jonah, as always, it's such a great pleasure to hear how you think through these things, which I know just makes writers better at what they do because they can start speaking and having the vocabulary of an editor as they start doing their own stories and pitching their own stories. So as always, what a pleasure, and we'll do this again soon.
I always have such a great time being here and talking with you. Thanks for having me.
Okay. All right. It's always nice hearing from Jonah. So now we've got Matthew Wolfe. His first Atavist story was The Ghosts of Pickering Trail. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, The Atlantic, Harper's, Pop-Up Magazine, The New Republic. Hold on. Maybe I should just read the publications he has not written for. Okay? Hold on. Oh, there are none. Shit. You can find out more about Matt at MatthewWolfe.net. Matt likes to lean on TV and screenplays to help him with story structure. As a means of developing stories, he uses the Dan Harmon Story Circle to help with structure, and I'll link up to that in the show notes. We talk about not being mercenary about stories and leaning into ones that won't let go of you. And one of the more bizarre recommendations at the end that you'll ever hear. So let's just get after it. Riff. Yeah, my understanding is that this isn't your first Atavist rodeo.
So this is a story that I did with my friend Will Hunt, and we were both doing a grad program at NYU, with the amazingly pretentious name of literary reportage. It was out of the journalism school, which is basically an MFA in nonfiction, and we were walking to, if you know NYU's campus, there's a big library on Washington Square Park called Bope's Library. And Bope's, when you walk in, there's this big, like 12-story atrium. And we were friends with the librarian who's working there. And she told us this like totally horrific story about a rash of suicides that had happened in Bope's, which was I don't know, I had no knowledge of, but was obviously pretty traumatizing for everybody who worked there. And so she was talking about the NYU had this funny job of afterwards of trying to figure out both how to basically change the architecture of Bope's to make it less hospitable to people trying to kill themselves, and also sort of more broadly how to re-engineer the space so that it felt, as she put it, less haunted. Like they wanted it to. So they wanted to try and kind of excise the memory of the suicides, which was a really weird architectural challenge, but was apparently something that was very important to the school. So my friend Will and I began to sort of think about this, and we were like, God, that's such a weird specialty to have, architectural spaces where terrible things have happened, and then try and recuperate them somehow. So we began to sort of look around and we were thinking about, there's got to be somebody who's like kind of good at this, or like somebody who's like made a practice of this. We met this guy in Southern California named Randall Bell, who's an appraiser of real estate, whose whole practice is built around repairing the spiritual aura of haunted spaces. So he dealt with a whole bunch of really famous properties, and he would get, after something really bad would happen, like a mass shooting or a particularly gory murder, he would get called in and he would be asked, how do we keep the space but make it different, or if it's not possible, how do we tear it down? So he worked on like the Nicole Brown Simpson house for the OJ Simpson killing. He would work on the Sandy Hook School up in Newtown, Connecticut. He worked on Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment complex. So we got totally fascinated by this guy, and we ended up writing a story for the Atavist about a haunted house in Pennsylvania where a woman had moved in with her 2 kids, and the house had kind of weird vibes. She'd moved from across the country, so she didn't really know anything about the property. And after having these weird experiences in the house for a few months, a neighbor finally confided in her, and he was like, yeah, there was a triple murder in there before you moved in. So she ended up having to call in Randall Bell to try and figure out, like, how do I like re-engineer the space so that it doesn't feel, it's not like haunting my kids. So that was the first Atavist story we did about this weird haunted house in Pennsylvania, and this whole larger idea of what they call stigmatized real estate, which is it was really fun writing for the Atavist because they let you bring in something that doesn't necessarily have a super current news peg, but is a story that can, as long as it carries, it kind of works, or as long as it resonates with, it has kind of larger themes to it. I really admire the Atavist promiscuity with regards to the kind of stories it's interested in. So it was fun. That first story, that was really fun to write, and then the second one was also something that I couldn't really imagine publishing anywhere else.
Yeah, they definitely have a certain like a style. It's very story driven, narrative driven, and that attracts a particular writer with a certain sensibility. So how did you lock into this kind of nonfiction narratives? Maybe what were some stories that you read or books you read that really drew you into this world?
Man, I don't know. I grew up wanting to make movies.
Mm-hmm.
So it was something, it was one of those, I've always been a real fan of just plot. I mean, just I read a lot of screenplays. I think with stories, it's so dependent on structure, and it's so dependent on putting everything in the right order and organizing information in a way that it carries. It's an aspect of writing I'm really drawn to. It's something a little bit more geometric than certain other parts of it. There are a ton of writers I love. I think I grew up sort of reading. My family, subscribed to the New Yorker, and I think I internalized an idea that the New Yorker story, where there's this narrative, and then there's this that works as this kind of spine on which you can hang a lot of organs of exposition. That's sort of how you're supposed to do nonfiction. I remember probably at a formative moment, I think I read Richard Preston, Mountains of Pi article, if you know that one.
I don't. Yeah.
Are you familiar with that?
No.
So it's one, it was it got kind of loosely adapted into the Darren Aronofsky film Pi, about this obsessive mathematician who's trying to learn the secrets of pi. But it's this article about a guy that Preston wrote for the New Yorker about these brothers who live in Upper West Side of Manhattan, are sort of affiliated with Columbia University, and they're mathematicians, and they turned their entire apartment into one giant computer, and all it does is try and derive pi to the billionth decimal point, and that's all it does. And it was a perfect story. I mean, it's beautifully written, but it also has its center somebody who's completely obsessed with something. And I found that that's generally, if you're going to have a narrative story that works, it really helps to have somebody who is irrationally fixated on a goal, and can do it, that allows them to do traditional protagonist operations in a way that gives you a lot to work with as a writer. So I think that kind of, I would love stuff. I mean, I read all Pauline Kael and Janet Malcolm, and they don't really operate in that way. But I think something about the New Yorker DNA got injected into me fairly early on. I think I've never really quite been able to get away from that understanding of how nonfiction is supposed to work.
Yeah, the obsession component is something I'm drawn to as well, with various central figures, because I deeply admire someone's like all in obsession, be it sports or maybe a private investigator, totally, or like a stigmatized real estate or whatever, like just that vision and focus I admire, because I think I lack quite a bit of it. So I admire it in others. So I don't know, like what's part, I don't know, maybe does that resonate with you too?
Yeah, totally. I took in that grad program, I was talking about literary reportage. We took like a kind of like a subcultural class, like a class on how do you report on subcultures. And I remember everybody was sort of, when the teacher asked the first meeting, sort of, why are you taking this class? And everybody confessed to saying like, yeah, well, I don't really have a subculture. I'm not really part of anything. So I think there's always, the journalism, there's always a little bit of with your nose up against the window looking in. And I feel like anyway, I think, beyond a particular obsession with story structure, no, I don't have but I'm sure you have this with your work. I mean, where you figure out, like, in terms of picking a story, the story sort of picks you, like it just gets your hooks in you, and then you have to finish it out, or you have to report it, even if it's financially a terrible idea, or something that's like, it's not there's no real reason for you to do it. So I suppose that there is a certain amount of obsession embedded into anybody who's doing this profession right now.
Yeah, well, to your point of the story choosing you, when Nick Davidson was on a couple months ago for the Atavist, yeah, he's at a point in his career and having, because I guess the three of us were roughly the same age, who kind of been in this for a while, and he's just more or less surrenders to it instead of just constantly being on the hunt for stories. He's gotten to a point where he does kind of just let it happen and just like surrender to what finds him. He was kind of woo woo in a way, but in a way when you kind of soften to that, things do find you.
I think it's much grimmer to be like rationalist about it, or to be like strategic, or to say like the idea of doing this and saying it, being completely mercenary and having to spend like months or years on something that you imagine other people are going to like, but that you yourself are not particularly attracted to. That sounds horrific. So, but yeah, I think you have to a little bit of the woo woo in there.
I think so. Yeah, I think you're right there, because it does get awfully bleak when you do take that mercenary mindset, because then it's nonstop hustle, and that hustle is just, oh my God, that treadmill sucks, and the speed just seems to keep going. Like, oh my God, like I can't keep up with this treadmill any longer.
Yeah, no, it's pretty bad.
So how did you lock into this your new Atavist story on Sheridan Bruseaux?
It's a total accident. I was doing so I finished up a PhD in sociology at NYU, a couple years ago, and there was a chapter of my dissertation that, long story short, required me to read a lot of late 19th and early 20th century newspapers, which, if you ever have the chance, are really fun. There's a lot of weird stuff in there. So it's just, I was just sort of going through the archives, and I ended up coming across a mention of this guy, Sheridan Bruseaux, who I had never heard of at all. But I was reading the article. It was written in such a way that the audience in the, like, I think it would have been the 1920s, was supposed to know this guy. So he's clearly like a figure of some repute at that particular moment. I gleaned he was a private investigator, and so I started digging into it a little bit more, and I realized that he was not just a private investigator, but a private investigator who worked in a number of kind of prominent cases in Chicago, and he was Black, and he was, in fact, as far as I could tell, the first Black private detective in the United States. I'm sure there were guys before him who probably did some kind of unofficial investigation, but in terms of being like a licensed bonded PI, he was the first, in terms of the first guy to like sort of own his own investigative practice. So I was kind of interested in that. I was like, oh, that's an interesting field to plow. But yeah, so I started reading. I started going through all these old newspapers and reading more about him, and nothing had been written about him since about the 1940s. So it took a little reading through a lot of old journalism, getting sort of like sort of gleaning information about him. Like an article would have one little, would talk about a particular case he worked on, and then might sort of hint at a little fact some fact about his life, because there's nothing, I think, other than one completely lie-filled profile from Ebony magazine from the 1940s. There'd been nothing of length written about him. So it required a little bit of work on my part to try and learn more about who he was, and sort of put together a story around him.
Yeah, when there wasn't much by way of his own voice in the research, how were you able to flesh out his character? Given that there was not much on him.
Yeah, this is the first time I'd ever done like an article where it was purely historical, or where it was something where I was only drawing from archives. And there's stuff about it I liked, but it was very different. It was like, when you're reporting a contemporary piece, you can call the person you're writing about them, ask them questions usually, or you can call people who knew them, or, and you can always kind of do more research on whatever you're writing about. But with historical stuff, it's weird. It's like you've got a really finite amount of information that you're working with, and there are real limits to what you can know about somebody who's been dead for decades and who um, doesn't have a sort of vast archive of their own writing or their own voice somewhere. So I guess if writing a contemporary um, long form piece is kind of like, I guess it's kind of like, you go to the supermarket and you get to pick from a store full of ingredients, and you come back and you make a nice meal. Doing a piece where you're relying on archives is a little bit like having to um, it's a little like dumpster diving. It's kind of like whatever you find in there is what you're going to be making that night. And that was the case with Bruseaux, where there was real stuff that I would have liked to. There were things about him that I would have liked to know more about, and it just wasn't there. I just sort of was dependent on what I could find in newspapers and NAACP files and court records, and so it's frustrating, but it's also an interesting, satisfying creative challenge to have to make a meal with just a few motes of food.
Yeah. Yeah. When did you feel confident that you had, a narrative worthy here of pitching to a place like the Atavist?
Yeah, so it's a great question that I was thinking about this, and it was like there's a certain style of story that's the first, X of Y, or the first and which is a interesting lead into a story, like the first Scottish trombonist, the first bisexual lacrosse player. Like these are they potentially open like an avenue to something interesting, but that status by itself is not enough does not work as a narrative that will carry you through 6, 8, 10,000 words. So I started reading more about Bruseaux, and gradually I was just sort of going through some decades of his casework. Very gradually, kind of a picture kind of filled in for him, where it was clear that he'd built his practice doing kind of normal PI stuff like embezzlements and finding missing persons and catching con men, but he also had this kind of sideline investigating racial violence, of which there was quite a lot in 1920s Chicago. So he investigated bombings of black churches and lynchings, and which was all interesting, which was all makes for a potentially interesting protagonist, or somebody who's worth investigating more. But I think it was actually when I began to figure out that there was stuff about Bruceau's character that wasn't great, when it became clear that he wasn't actually a saint, that I was much more drawn to it, since I think writing a hagiography about someone or is can be a praiseworthy endeavor, but I don't think saints are very interesting characters by themselves without something cutting against that. So finding out that Bruseaux actually was a little bit dishonest and took some moral shortcuts and did some unsavory things, and was at the point where I began to think, okay, this is potentially worth writing about, or he's somebody who I'd like to figure out a story around.
Yeah, and I always love getting a sense of unique challenges to this story that were presented to you over the course of your research, and how you were reconstructing the narrative, and just those little roadblocks along the way that you ran into, and how you cracked the code. So what were some unique challenges to this story for you, Matt?
Man, I think it's what you were saying before, Brendan, about it's with historical work, it's just it's sort of you don't get that same voice, or you don't get somebody who's you're able to talk to the degree that you feel satisfied that you're able to offer some rendering of them that offers at least provides at least a sort of simulacra of of reality, or that some kind of rendering of somebody that feels convincing. There were very little for so Bruseaux was, for all of his, he was a fairly well-known figure at the time in the 1920s, 1930s. Very little of his writing exists. I spoke with some of his descendants with the hope that there might be, a diary or some other kind of private written record from him, and there wasn't. And it was even to the point where there wasn't even very many quotes from him he received a lot of press coverage, but he didn't seem to talk directly to reporters a lot, or at least they didn't quote him a lot. So the absence of a sort of clear voice was enormously frustrating. It was something that I really missed in the story. It was a real challenge to try and figure out, like, okay, how do you provide some kind of account of this guy with these huge gaps, both in terms of what he was like as a person, and then a sort of deeper sense of motivation, or having a real opacity about why he did what he did, or why he made some of the choices he made.
Yeah, and there's a tremendous amount of archival research and even ancestry research, and for a lot of people doing narrative nonfiction, like getting into those kind of archives and databases is really crucial to like find people. Men are typically easier to find because their names don't change, but with, I don't know, just in your experience here, how can people maybe get better at trolling these ancestral archives to find these crucial people to talk to?
Man, yeah, you're right. There were huge gaps in the stuff. There was a part in the Atavist story that got cut where I was talking about Bruceau's father had been born into slavery in Louisiana, and he ended up serving in a black regiment in the Civil War. Really interesting story in its own right. But I was trying to learn more about him, and the fact that he'd been born into onto a plantation in Louisiana meant that there was no census record of him at all. It was something where he was born into. There was no birth certificate. There was no. When looking at enslaved people from the first half of the 19th century, the sort of closest you can get sometimes to finding records of them is through wills and estate records, where they're passed off as property from one person to another, and I'll sort of mention in passing that a enslaved person of a particular name is bequeathed to somebody else. But there was not. As you say, there are these huge gaps in terms of what we know about certain people's lives, and it's a very difficult thing to overcome. At the same time, the fact that in the last few decades, huge amounts of data have been digitized allows people to tell stories that just haven't been able to be told before. There's stuff I was able to find out about Bruceaux from, say, like the NAACP archives, or even just from the number of historical newspapers that have been digitized since the 90s, that made it possible to tell the story in a way that just wouldn't have been the case even 20 years ago. There are enormous gaps, but there's also a very exciting chance to fill them, or to understand things that just haven't been possible.
Yeah. And do you know how to find, say there's, and this could just be in general, like, you see maybe, a woman's name in a yearbook, and like odds are her surname is changed, and then it's harder to track them down. Like, how do you find someone like that? Because I imagine there are a lot of people who need to track people down like that when they're doing their internet stalking for these kind of stories.
Yeah, man, I think I've gotten a little better at it, but I think you just go into. There's a lot of. America's pretty bad about protecting data. Like, if you try and find somebody even in Canada or in France, it's very, very difficult. But in America, because we're believe in personal freedom, it's much easier to figure out somebody's new name or their new address, and there are a lot of archives or services used by historians, but also by like private investigators to try and figure these things out. And there's a real, for older ones, ancestry.com is a good start. There's some really wonderful ProQuest, newspapers.com, which is a private database, but actually quite good. There are a lot of state archives. I went into Illinois, makes available a number of African American newspapers in one of their digitized state archives. That was fantastic. So I think it takes a lot of patient, obsessive guesswork at the computer and trial and error of trying to figure out, trying to put together this paper trail from all these with a lot of dead ends and wrong turns, but which is pretty fun to do sometimes.
Yeah, there's kind of a, just in hearing you talk about this and the story that you wrote here, there's a bit of a meta quality, because this kind of journalism is almost akin to private investigation. And I don't know, just how do you think about, like, does that rhyme kind of with what you're doing here and writing about?
So for a brief period of unemployment, I actually worked for a private investigator where I had to do a little bit of work like this. And yeah, it's very similar. Like you're trying to find people who don't necessarily want to be found, and you try to get them to talk about stuff that they don't necessarily want to talk about. So I think private investigators make good subjects for journalists, both because they tend to be obsessed. They have a clear goal, and there's also, as you say, there's something pretty simpatico there between the two professions.
Yeah, tell me a little more about your experience there. Like that seems, yeah, I'd love to hear a little more.
I think I'm under an NDA, but I
Oh.
was doing a long story short, I'd gotten out of my grad program and was thoroughly unemployed. So I began working for a private investigator who had worked for a number of law firms, and it required me. It was not the kind of in private investigation where you're slouching low in a car with a telephoto lens and catching people cheating on their second wives. It was the there's a legal filing that needs some building out, so you've got to call some people and try and get them to talk about something that they absolutely should not be talking about.
Mm.
But was just interesting. I mean, it was something. It both required exactly the kind of skill set you're talking about, of trying to find somebody, of trying to like figure out, like, as any reporter knows, a lot of your job is sometimes just trying to find a working phone number, a working email address,
Yeah.
and which is its own little puzzle sometimes. And then once you get it, how do you get that person to feel okay telling you things? I think, yeah, and I which is, some days is fun, some days is just the absolute worst part of the job.
Yeah. I feel like more journalists should consider not going to be like PR flacks. They should go into private investigation. I feel like the skill set
Oh man,
translates
yeah.
more.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I feel like that's going to be, at least you're going to have better stories at the end of the day if you go into private investigation work. You'll at least be able to entertain people at cocktail parties, which is harder to do when you're writing press
Yeah, no
releases.
kidding. So when I was reading the Bruseaux piece too, it and I believe you even make a grace note mention of it in the piece. Like there's a very like Gatsby like quality to this guy, and you see this a lot of this reinvention for people across decades, and especially in the 20th century. There's a reason why Gatsby resonates and feels so timeless. And just what was the Gatsby-esque quality that that just pulses through this story?
So, I mean, I think, as I was saying before, I mean, when I was first reading about Sheridan Bruseaux and about him building up this private, this being first Black private investigator, building up this private investigative practice, I was less interested when it seemed like he was doing, laudable things, and a skillful investigator, which again, very worthy of praise, but doesn't um, is not does not necessarily make for a compelling protagonist. But it was when there was sort of began reading about him throwing these very lavish parties, and trying to, and sort of as I got deeper into the records, realized that he had so Bruseaux was born in the Deep South or in Arkansas, and moved up to Chicago in the early 20th century. And when he did so, he reinvented himself. He actually ended up lying a lot about his background. He invented, some college degree that he didn't have. He claimed that he'd been part of the U.S. Secret Service's intelligence bureau in Europe during World War One. He claimed that he'd been a private investigator for another, well-established detective agency. None of this was true, but he used these lies to found his own detective agency, and he turned out to be an excellent investigator. He turned out to be, enormously successful, and built into America is a certain fluidity of identity. And there are honest ways of pursuing that, and there are dishonest ways of pursuing that. But I think all Americans resonate a little bit with the con man who creates a personal mythology to get ahead. Joseph Beuys was German, but I think we all appreciate the man of spectacular talents who creates a fictitious background for himself or herself, and it becomes a success by dint of that brings themselves into existence in that way, just by sheer will. And I think we certainly have an infinite number of exemplars of that today, of people who have become the thing that they say they are without the background that should allow for it. So I think Bruseaux fits into a noble American tradition of heroic dishonesty, and I really, it's hard to not like a Gatsby. It really is.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, you even think with Mad Men how the Don
Totally.
Draper character assumes another identity because you can't shake off the stain of your heredity unless you can just totally subsume someone else's identity, and then you try those clothes on. You're like, yes, I'm going to be this now, until you're found out, and hopefully you never are, but some people are.
Right, and there are hints of Bruseaux, like Draper, had these. There was sort of undercurrents of insecurity that would bubble up every so often, where Bruseaux sort of seemed to overcompensate by sometimes lying in ways that just he didn't need to do, or for getting himself into trouble. Don Draper probably shouldn't be a hero, and yet he is.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and what struck me in reading the piece also, and I got a draft that had all your footnotes and your annotations, and it's just an impressive amount of research, that you put into an 8,000 word narrative. Yeah, for sure. And you get a sense of my God, the heavy lifting that goes into this to create these kind of things. And so when you're doing this kind of research and organizing that stuff and footnoting things, how best do you approach it?
Great question. I begin with Scrivener. I don't know how I'd do any writing without Scrivener at this point, which is, for those who are uninitiate, is a word processing program that has a sort of file structure built into it, and allows you to organize a lot of disparate information. With Bruseaux, and I do this with a lot of stories, it's I end up with sort of a big sloppy document after a while that I call just a fact draft. And it's something where it can be maybe it'll be just a concatenation of sentences with a footnote on them, and it'll just be one fact, or it'll be just one. Sometimes it'll be one or two, but from one source. And in Bruseaux, this was particularly true in Bruseaux because I had to read through probably a few thousand old newspaper articles, and a lot of them weren't relevant, but the ones that were, I'd get maybe one thing about Bruseaux. I'd read the whole piece and say, okay, here was in 1936, he investigated this strange murder case of a auditor of the National Baptist Convention, or here's a record from a congressman's archive that says that where Bruseaux wrote him a note, and Bruseaux said that asked for money because he was in debt, several $100s because a catering company had gotten put a lien on him or something like that. So all these kind of disparate facts, and then I think I sort of take these hundreds of lines and begin to try and put them in some kind of order that makes a certain amount of sense. It's a little bit like assembling a mosaic, where you've got all these little individual discrete pieces of something, and you just begin to sort of put it into an order that's satisfying. I again, sort of looping back in satisfyingly circular fashion to I'm very reliant on traditional screenwriting structure of around the hero's journey. I use friends make fun of me because I sort of everything I write goes in the, if you're familiar with Dan Harmon's story circle, where there's this is sort of a distillation of the hero's journey, where a character begins at a point of equilibrium, goes on, has this sort of intervention that causes them to reassess things. Then they go on this journey where they're trying to adopt painfully this new identity, and then eventually they sort of reach, after having some kind of consequent shift in their internal dynamics, they return to a state of equilibrium. And I think taking hundreds of facts and trying to put it into a structure where a protagonist moves through space, I love that part. I love that. I love trying to figure out how to bend messy, chaotic reality into some kind of artificial order.
Yeah.
And with Bruseaux, it ended up having this very sort of satisfying rise and fall narrative of something where he was somebody who, overcame great challenges to build himself up, to do phenomenal work, and then had this classic Hamarthia, had this flaw that brought him down in the end, and that caused his downfall. And I got, again, sort of going back to your original question of when do you know this story when do you know something that you're interested in or obsessed with sort of works as a piece of long form. And I think the shortest answer would be, for me at least, when I realize it can kind of fit into a structure that's satisfying, or when it has some kind of internal dynamics that allow a reader to sort of move through space in a way that feels good.
Yeah, that's really astute. I think people might not take, or they don't think about structure enough at the early outset. You might have something that's kind of factually cool, but if it doesn't fit into a satisfying structure that's sort of just embedded in our DNA that like pulls us through these narratives, then it just might not feel satisfying. It might just not work. And so, using that as a stencil is really smart, I think.
I'm just not that. There are plenty of non-form pieces that don't, that are phenomenal, that don't follow the structure at all. But for me, I need this. I need this little crutch to try and just organize information. But yeah, man, there are a lot of stories I've had where it's had good ingredients. It's had stuff that's interesting, or stuff that I'm really drawn to, but I can't make it structurally. I just can't make it work, or I just can't sort of get you through. I just couldn't figure out a way to get the reader through the information in a way that was where I felt like they'd hang on for it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well put. And with this Dan Harmon story circle, is that the same Dan Harmon who did Community? Comedy writer?
Yeah, same. Yeah, he's famous for having he's famous for having these in his writer's room, having these story circles that all the episodes have to follow, and breaking the story by within this and having and before every episode is written, there's this fully annotated circle that describes the particular plot of a Community episode or Rick and Morty episode. And it's I think that stuff gets to be a problem when you're trying to, going back to sort of what we were speaking about in the beginning of the conversation, when you're being mercenary about it, or when you're picking something that you feel like satisfies a particular form, and the kind of strategic element of story selection comes first before the obsession. I think that's when you get into trouble. I think when you start, I think it's true of screenplay writing too, when you say like, I'm gonna I'm going to make sure that this film, looks like Star Wars, or this film follows a particular mold for how a story is supposed to go. I think it's hard to make good product that way. I think it's when you're using that as a guide or a mold into which to pour your own personal, completely irrational obsessions. It's a nice. I think it allows you. It's sanity saving, at least for me. Again, I mean, this is not a prescription for long form at all. I mean, there are so many amazing writers who do not write stories like this. So it's really, for me, just sort of how I approach the material.
Yeah, as what are some other, as maybe movies that you return to again because you love the structure and you're like, oh, this is great. If I can find my facts and research to kind of pour into that mold, like this is just very satisfying for your taste.
God, it's funny. There's a lot of I think TV is sort of more reliant on this than film in some ways. You can do a little pirouetting in film, and you can get away from structure with cinema in a way that I think TV is very unforgiving about. So I go to my mom, bless her heart, a Christmas or two ago, gave me the complete Succession scripts, like all 4 seasons. It was like 3,000. It's like 3 or 4,000 pages of just Jesse Armstrong dialogue. And I think I read the entire thing in like 2 weeks, and it was a wonderful lesson in how you make something just relentlessly interesting on a both on a line level, and then a sort of a scene level, and then a episode level. And it requires, there's a lot of talking about Succession or really good TV shows, we sometimes talk about particular lines of dialogue or particular characters. But that show, like a lot of really good shows, works because it's structured just so carefully, and it's structured in a way that's sort of just pulls the audience forward over and over and over again, and just sort of makes you move through it in a way where you're just compelled to keep watching. And I think there's a lot of good television that does that really, really well. I think Andor recently was a huge fan of. My partner and I watched The Terror, the show about the doomed Arctic exploration. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned from well-structured television for any kind of writing about just how you sustain interest, and how you offer information in a way that's satisfying to a viewer or to a reader.
Yeah, it's really astutely. I think of getting into the math of a scene and the math of structure. It can feel kind of clinical at first, but then when you can use it effectively, like interrogate it, like what is this doing for this scene? Like what is it doing for the part or the chapter? And then the arcs, and you're like, okay, what direction are we going in here? And when you start asking those critical questions, as much as you might love certain things are just going to fall off the skeleton naturally.
Totally.
But yeah, you got to be asking those questions of yourself and of the text.
Yeah, just taking like a screenplay, or just taking like a piece that you like, and just stripping that thing for parts, and just trying to figure out, and just sort of taking it apart and figuring out, like, all right, why, if this thing's making me, if I'm delighted by this, what's the grammar of that delight? Like, what's the machine that produced that? And I think that's it's thankfully a part of writing I really enjoy, or sort of thinking through that aspect of it, and then trying to recreate it. I think you're completely right about that. I think it's really, really having to sort of read things both with one eye towards pleasure, and then one eye towards the mechanisms by which that pleasure is generated.
Yeah, and just as a knucklehead sports writer, I always use the analogy of just coaches and quarterbacks looking over game tape. and they'll see the all 22, and they'll play, and they're looking, and they rewind, play, over and over again.
Totally.
And like that's what we do as writers too. Like something is like, what is going on here? Oh, but look at all these little things that like is happening in this part, but it matters to the ultimate locomotion of a play, even if it doesn't feel related. And it's like, yeah, okay, how can I then recreate that myself in my own work? And that's the kind of breakdown you need to do.
I remember reading, I was still a huge Philip Gravich fan. I remember reading his Rwanda book, and the subject matter is amazing, but just at the level of just every paragraph would begin with something that got you into it in a way that was opened up something for you, and then every paragraph ended with something where there was a little kicker that got you out of it. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think breaking down at the sentence level or the graph level or the chapter level, murdering and dissecting the thing you love is really quite important, even if it comes at the risk of disenchanting it. Yeah.
I like also getting a sense of advice that maybe you've received or it just hard won through your career. Maybe, if young journalists are asking you like, yeah, what's some advice you have, like what you like to give, or advice bestowed upon you by a treasured mentor. Like, what is some good, advice in this, this morass we've gotten ourselves into that you lean on?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's like doing long form nonfiction right now is a little bit like if you get really good at it, it's a little bit like getting really good at like vaudeville in 1976. It's like that's great. You may not be able to earn a living from it, but there's still there are a lot of vaudevillians around who can maybe give you some tips on it. I don't know. I mean, I think it's something. I think it's, again, going back to the beginning of our conversation. I think it's really important to follow your obsession, or to allow, as you put it, the kind of woo woo in there. Like, I don't think you can, if you're going to be completely mercenary about what kind of stories you want to do, or you're going to do it out of some calculation, there are other ways of being bloodless and calculating that will make you so much more money. So I feel like if you're going to do this, I think it's just important to be very honest with yourself about what you're interested in, and follow that. People will talk to you. I mean, it's funny. It's like, I think it's with our more mediated age, I think younger journalists may not have as much experience interviewing people or talking with them. And I think the advice that I give in that, and actually in sociology too, is just, if you're sincerely interested in something, it'll open a lot of doors. There are people who really, there aren't that many situations in which somebody approaches you and is really sincerely interested in what you have to say. And I think if you embody that, or if you approach somebody with being honest and openly excited about what they have to tell you, I think that's the best way of going about things. So that can really yield something pretty good sometimes.
Yeah, and in your piece, even though it's so heavily researched in like the archives and ancestral parts, like you do come into the story at the end where you are able to find some of the descendants of Bruseaux and talk to them. So what was illuminating about finding them and having conversation with living descendants?
Yeah, it was. So I wanted to. I think I was curious, both from both as a potential repository of facts about Bruseaux. I wanted to approach descendants, but also I was just curious about. I think there's something about when you're writing about a historical figure. Particularly in this case, I mean, I'm white and Bruseaux is black. I wanted to. There's stuff about that I'm not gonna get, or I'm not gonna be able to understand, or I'm not going to be able to. That's going to be distant from my own experience. So I wanted to check in with the people who were within his line, just as both to say, hey, I'm writing this thing, and to say I'm happy to answer any questions about what I'm doing, but also just to sort of understand. I was really curious. I was like, what have you heard about him? What's the what do you make of this? How should I think about this potentially? And I think that's again, this is the first time I've written something where I've only the entire article's been based on archival work. So I think it was maybe a vain hope of hoping to bridge some inextricable distance from the subject matter that I probably wouldn't otherwise be able to I just can't access.
Very nice. Well, as we bring these conversations out for a landing, Matt, I always love also asking for a recommendation of some kind. It's just like anything you're excited about that you want to share with the listeners. So just extend that to you. What would you recommend for the listeners out there?
Okay, I'm gonna give totally left field response.
Nice.
So this has nothing to do with anything I'm doing, but I came across it not that long ago, and I've been a little bit obsessed with it. So in the mid '90s, the BBC did a 4-part documentary series about the Yugoslavian Civil War. And I'm already hearing people tune this out and be like, no, I don't have any interest in the Yugoslavian Civil War. I don't need to watch a documentary from 1995 about it. So the thing that it is bar none one of the best nonfiction anything I've ever seen. It's 4 parts, and the thing that they do is that they get somehow the producers of this, who are in the documentary, are tracing the Yugoslavian conflict and the country's breakup and this incredibly grisly civil war that happened. They get interviews with every major participant in it, with the presidents of each of the territories, with generals. So it's a little bit like the equivalent would be like if you did a 4-part documentary about the American Civil War and you got like Grant and Lee and Lincoln to sit for talking head interviews and like annotate what had happened, like basically in real time. It's insane.
Wow.
And it got me completely, and I had no particular connection to the subject matter, completely enthralled. Like it's available, I think, on YouTube. I think it might be on the BBC player. I cannot recommend it enough. I'm not sure. I think in the age of social media, it would be probably impossible to do now, but it is a amazing object lesson in rendering something compelling out of subject matter to which the viewer has potentially no allegiance or fealty or particular interest in to begin with. So shout outs to the 4-part BBC Yugoslavian Civil War documentary. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing, Matt. Well, this is so cool. The story for the Atavist was incredible. It's just a really gripping read. So I really appreciate the work and carving out some time to come on and talk some shop. This was awesome.
Man, thanks so much for doing this podcast. I'm so happy it exists, and really thanks for having me on. It's been so fun.
Okay. Yes. Awesome. Thank you to Jonah and thank you to Matt for coming by, talking some shop. Go to magazine.atavist.com to read the story and potentially subscribe. And be sure you're following along with me, BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, also Instagram at Creative Nonfiction Podcast. Blue Sky is at BrendanO'Mara.bluesky.social. And then there's the 2 flagship newsletters. Welcome to pitchclub.substack.com and the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Great stuff. All right, the key is to read what I'm about to read without tearing up. I think I can do it. Yeah, it's been a bit of a harrowing week. So Kevin is our German Shepherd, and she's older, 10, 11, 12, hard to know. She was running around the backyard, and she stepped wrong, let out a yelp, and then she could barely move her left hind leg. We took her to the vet. Turns out she got a partial tear of her cruciate ligament. Think ACL in humans. And we thought it might have been a full tear, but x-rays and such determined it was a partial tear. But the imaging we got revealed that her spine is like horribly arthritic, which is somewhat common in Germans. And suddenly we're very much aware that we're getting close to the end, or this was very much a moment of the beginning of the end. Yeah, maybe not weeks, but months, or maybe no guarantee. Years is definitely getting to some speculative territory. We have a pretty good rehab plan in place for her to get her leg back up and running. Not literally up and running, but get that healed up. She has to be on carprofen for inflammation for muscles and joints, and gabapentin for some nerve-related pain, since she's developing a narrowing of her discs, especially in her upper back, which is likely led to excessive right shoulder limping. So she's sleeping on the floor beside me, right now, and we have to keep her from jumping on things. She likes to jump up on the couch in this other chair, so we can't let her do that for fear that she would fully rupture her knee. And then it's like, well, do you spend, I don't know, 10 grand doing a knee repair when she's got other issues? These are the things you got to think about. But there's really no thinking. We'll do everything that's right for her. And the other morning, the day after she was under anesthesia for the imaging, she was pacing and whining, which made me think maybe she was in like a tremendous amount of pain. And when an older dog is in great pain, you have to start thinking about whether or not it's time to let them go and cross that rainbow bridge. You have to make that choice, and it's the most awful choice you have to make. It's terrible. I'm sure a lot of you have done it. I've done it a few times. It's the worst. It sucks. It turns out she was just sick from her procedure from the day before, so she hasn't been whiny or that uncomfortable since. So that was a relief. The meds are making her a little sleepy, which for now is good because she needs a lot of rest, so she's not putting too much strain on her legs. She hasn't had a full meal in a day or two, and that's upsetting because they need to eat, and usually if they stop eating, that's not a good sign. And when these critters get old, man, it starts to become day to day, very instantly day to day. They degrade so quickly. Like that happened with Jack and Smarty. It's like, they were old and slow, but fine. And then in a couple days, it was just done. They're gone. And we were letting them go. I don't know why we sign up for this pain. I was laying on the floor with Kevin the other day, telling her just to please get better. And I was crying because, if she goes and leaves us with the boys, I'll just be so fucking pissed. And a couple days ago, the boys got into a fight when a door accidentally swung open. They haven't had an incident in nearly 2 years, but they picked up right where they left off. Fortunately, there were no cuts or blood, just spittle. We were able to intervene in time. Yeah, things have been really tense and scary and just sad. And that's the drama. It's been very hard to focus. I'm falling behind in a lot of my reading and my writing. Podcast has been hard to keep up with. I keep doing it, because you gotta show up. But it hasn't been without its challenges, let's say. Gotta rally. So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do interviews, see ya.